There's a particular kind of silence that feels heavier than others. Not the silence after an argument and not the silence after something clearly ends, but the quiet that arrives slowly. Messages that used to come without effort start spacing. Out replies feel delayed, shorter, less alive. Nothing dramatic happens. No confrontation, no explanation, just distance. And that's usually where the confusion begins. As Dr. Sophia would explain, this kind of silence carries psychological weight because it removes certainty without offering closure, which leaves the mind searching for meaning instead of resting in clarity. Asterisk, most people assume silence means disinterest, avoidance, or that something went wrong they somehow missed. But silence, especially when it stretches over time, is rarely just one thing. What's actually happening tends to unfold in stages. And once you understand those stages, the silence stops feeling random and starts feeling readable. This is important because when silence is understood as a process rather than a single event, it becomes easier to respond with self-control instead of emotional urgency. Asterisk at first, the gap doesn't feel intentional. Life gets busy together and people assume the rhythm will naturally return. There's no urgency because nothing feels broken yet. Silence at this stage still feels temporary. But psychologically, something has already shifted. Communication doesn't fade when interest disappears overnight. It fades when emotional priority changes, when someone stops organizing their inner world around the connection. That change almost always begins quietly. Dr. Sophia often emphasizes that the earliest shifts are subtle and internal long before they become visible through behavior. Asterisk, what matters most here isn't how long the silence lasts, but how it feels when it arrives. The silence feels neutral and relaxed. It's often circumstantial. But if it feels different, slower, colder, slightly off, that's usually your nervous system picking up on a loss of emotional momentum before your mind has words for it. This bodily awareness exists to protect you, even though many people learn to doubt it or override it with hope. Asterisk, emotional investment creates gravity. When someone feels internally pulled toward you, communication happens almost automatically, not because they're trying, but because you're already present in their mental background. When that gravity weakens, messages stop initiating themselves. And this doesn't always mean they like you less. Sometimes it means something else has taken precedence. Dr. Sophia notes that emotional gravity is not about intensity, but about placement. Where you sit in someone's internal priorities, asterisk, silence often appears when someone's attention shifts inward. Stress, uncertainty, and internal conflict consume emotional bandwidth. When that happens, communication with others becomes optional instead of instinctive. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like overload. This is why chasing clarity too early often backfires. When someone hasn't emotionally processed what's happening internally, pressure for explanation feels intrusive, even if the request is reasonable. Silence becomes a way to buy psychological space, not to punish or manipulate, but to regulate. Asterisk, as time passes, the silence changes character. Early silence is unformed. Later, silence becomes intentional. That's the turning point most people sense but don't consciously recognize. At this stage, the person isn't just failing to reach out. They're choosing not to. Not out of cruelty, but because responding would reopen something they're unsure they want to carry. Dr. Sophia explains that avoidance here is often a form of self-preservation rather than hostility. Asterisk, this is where meaning becomes clearer. When someone stops reaching out over a long period, it usually signals that the connection no longer feels emotionally necessary to them. Not necessarily unwanted, but no longer central. And that distinction matters because emotional necessity drives effort. When someone feels emotionally safe, validated, or energized by a connection, they naturally protect it. When that emotional payoff diminishes or starts to feel complicated, distance becomes easier than engagement. Silence becomes a form of simplification. People often assume silence means indifference. But indifference feels light. Silence often feels heavy because it's not indifference. It's ambivalence. Ambivalence is uncomfortable. It's the feeling of not knowing whether to lean in or step back. Many people resolve ambivalence not through conversation, but through distance. They wait for the feeling to decide for them. And if the feeling doesn't pull them back, the silence stretches over time. Silence stops being about emotion and starts being about identity. Responding would require re-engaging a version of themselves that no longer fits how they see their life now, so they don't. That's why explanations rarely come. Silence is often the explanation someone gives. When they don't fully understand their own shift or don't feel able to articulate it without causing pain. Dr. Sophia highlights that silence often communicates what words cannot safely express. At this point, the silence has a message, even if it's unspoken. It says the connection no longer organizes their behavior. That's difficult to accept, especially if nothing bad happened. But emotional bonds don't end only through conflict. Many dissolve through reorientation when people grow, change, or redirect their energy elsewhere. There's an important distinction that often gets overlooked. Silence that comes with emotional warmth, occasional check-ins, relaxed tone. Openness means something very different from silence that feels closed, delayed, or avoidant. The first is distance with goodwill. The second is distance with detachment. The difference isn't frequency, it's emotional texture. Understanding this distinction prevents people from mislabeling distance as rejection, when it may actually be transition. This is where people often create their own suffering. They interpret silence as a puzzle to solve, rather than a signal to read. They overanalyze timing, wording, and response length, searching for hidden meaning when the larger pattern has already revealed itself. Consistency tells the truth. Words avoid. Dr. Sophia encourages paying attention to patterns rather than isolated moments because patterns reflect reality more accurately than reassurance. After spending time with this pattern, it becomes impossible not to notice how often men experience this in dating and relationships, especially men who lead with reliability, availability, or emotional steadiness. Early on, those traits feel grounding. But over time, if the emotional polarity of the connection doesn't deepen, steadiness can fade into predictability. Predictability, when unbalanced, reduces emotional urgency. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means the dynamics stopped evolving. Silence in these cases reflects stagnation more than rejection. The connection stopped creating new emotional information. Without curiosity, tension, or depth, interest naturally decays. People don't maintain communication out of obligation. They maintain it out of emotional movement. When nothing internally moves, nothing externally follows. This is why sending more messages rarely restores momentum. Effort doesn't generate emotional gravity. Emotional gravity generates effort. Once gravity is gone, communication feels forced on one side and heavy on the other, and the silence becomes self-protective for both. Dr. Sophia often reminds that pushing against emotional gravity only reinforces imbalance. There's another layer worth acknowledging. Sometimes silence isn't about you at all. It's about someone choosing familiarity elsewhere. When people re-anchor emotionally, whether to another person, a new environment, or a different version of their life, old connections lose relevance without losing respect. Silence, then, isn't a statement, it's a transition. And transitions rarely announce themselves cleanly. What matters most is not decoding why someone stopped reaching out, but understanding what the silence now requires of you. Silence always shifts responsibility. At first, it tempts you to chase clarity. Later, it challenges you to reclaim self-respect. The healthiest response to prolonged silence is not interpretation, but alignment with reality as it is, not as it was. Asterisk silence clarifies hierarchy. If someone doesn't make space for you over time, you are no longer occupying emotional priority. No amount of explanation changes that. What does change is how you respond internally, whether you personalize it, resist it, or learn from it. Silence is not just about the other person's withdrawal. It's also an invitation to notice where you may have been investing in potential instead of presence. Asterisk where you waited for consistency instead of responding to patterns. In that sense, silence becomes informative, not about your worth, but about emotional reciprocity. Once you see it clearly, silence loses its power to destabilize you. You stop asking why they didn't message and start noticing what the pattern shows you. That shift from seeking reassurance to reading reality is where emotional maturity deepens. Asterisk silence doesn't always mean the same thing, but prolonged silence almost always leads to the same outcome. The connection, as it existed, has run its course. What comes next isn't about reigniting what's faded, but about understanding emotional momentum so you don't confuse presence with attachment again. That's a deeper conversation. And once you recognize these patterns, you start seeing them long before silence ever arrives. Asterisk silence like this doesn't usually arrive out of nowhere. It tends to appear after something quieter has already changed. The way attention is felt, the way effort flows, the way presence is responded to. And noticing that shift isn't about trying to control anyone else. It's about recognizing how certain dynamics form in the first place. Asterisk why some people naturally move toward you, while others slowly stop organizing their behavior around the connection. For a lot of men, the real question that comes out of moments like this isn't what went wrong, but why the same patterns keep repeating with different people. The next video explores that deeper layer. What actually causes people to treat certain men differently on a psychological level? Long before silence ever becomes part of the picture, as Dr. Sophia will continue to explain.